Thank you for your very informative and insightful presentation. Do you agree with the following proposition? 19 years ago, the Howard government completed the third stage of Paul Keating's three-stage privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. Howard and Keating supposedly despised each other, but they were thick as thieves when it came to the Thatcherite gutting of Australia's economy through deregulation and privatisation. Isn't it time to renationalise the Commonwealth Bank, restore its status as the national bank, and put it to work for all Australians, issuing credit for productive investments in infrastructure and industries, the productive physical economy from which the whole country will profit? In fact, why not nationalise the Big Four in their entirety under the name of the Commonwealth Bank?
I'm opposed to nationalising anything almost. Your points are well made though, when you say that given all this, maybe the government should control it, at least we get a straight hand played. No, I'm not against that, and I think it'll still come back to what we had before. This whole business is about greed. When I say greed, I mean you want to make as much money as you can. And the banks have got the money and they'll do whatever they can to make more. That's the way it is, because they'll be given bonuses, all that sort of stuff they'll do. That's why I don't think it would work.
But they provide a public service that should be publicly owned. And what can we expect from an incoming Labor government if they win the next election while they still deify Keating's Thatcherite legacy?
Well, I don't agree with you about publicly owned and publicly done. They're looking after private interests, which is making money. So, and if you're doing that, then of course you can do everything you can to screw as much money out as you can from the system.
Sure.
Yes. Well, I think we should have a public bank of major proportions. I think the Keating's privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank was a disaster.
And they use the name Commonwealth. Disgraceful.
Yeah, quite. And Howard just mocked it up at the end. But you know, the argument at the time, which you marginalised the left of the Labor caucus, was that the Commonwealth Bank, the government couldn't continue to pursue capital raising, which I think was a furphy, and also because deregulation had opened the sluice gates for incompetence and irresponsibility in the government-owned state banks. The Commonwealth Bank saved the State Savings Bank of Victoria, and so in any case, I mean, I think it was a disaster. It could have continued to play a public role. There are still public banks overseas, ironically in Germany. In particular, the subsidiary of the Commonwealth Bank structure was the Commonwealth Development Bank, which it was comprised of two parts, which created by Labor during and immediately after the war, and that was a specialist small business and farmer bank. There were a range of other public farmer banks, and so all those have been demolished or taken over by the private banks, and so there is no competition. You know, New Zealand ironically created the Kiwi Bank in the post office, and although that's still small scale, it nevertheless survives and proves that you can still do it. So the people who created the public banks at the state level, every state had them, and the Commonwealth Bank saw them as a means of providing facilities for those who weren't being served, and to keep the private bank greed in control. That was especially the case with Coombs, who was governor of the Commonwealth Bank in the post-war period. All that was completely swept away, and now there is no offset to the greed and the corruption. Yes.
Oh, hi, I'm Helen from Socialist Alliance. I just want to ask you to comment on a bill that was passed in February this year by the Federal Parliament, giving the Australia Prudential Regulation Authority the power, in the event of a financial crisis, to call on the banks to release their depositors' money, to bail themselves out, basically. So the APRA actually gives the banks the authority to steal their depositors' money. Can you comment on that, both of you, please?
I'm not sure about that because the money is, you may be right about that, but the money is held by the Reserve Bank. I don't think APRA has the money, but let's hope it doesn't come to that because that'll be messy.
Look, I had no idea this had happened, but I was recently informed of this law that you just mentioned by a character called Wilson Sy, S-Y, who used to work in APRA for a considerable period, and he lobbied the parliamentarians at the time to prevent its passage, but it went through, and it is, I think Joe's got it wrong, that in the interest of stability, the legislation says you can now appropriate customer deposits. They're just diabolical, and apparently it has already happened in Cyprus. So what's fascinating is completely under the radar in the media, and one presumes it'll never come to pass. But I agree that it's representative of the disdain that they hold for the general customer. Yeah.
Next question, please.
Yeah, Brian Concan. Yeah, you've got the Royal Commission going on with the banks and everything, but they're not touching upon the fractional reserve banking part of it. Banks never have enough money to fulfil the requirements of all the customers if there was a sudden rush on the banks. Just enough to... could you ever see that being touched upon, or is that the hidden secret of the banking system that's taboo? And as well, like all the central banks, any country that doesn't have a central bank, like they're destined for war. Like Iran has its Islamic banking institution there, which is the biggest enemy to the usury banking system. That's why the last few countries that have all been attacked all had their own nationalised bank, but as soon as they were attacked, the central bank was quickly replaced. It's like these central bankers, the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, associates, they rule the planet. It's like...
Thank you very much.
What are your comments on that, if anything, please?
Well, the banks don't like giving money out, and I think the situation that would arise, it could happen. They speculated now that could happen with all these home loans, and they're trying to equate that to the prime risk. But the person who can answer best is Joffrey, because when I was in the Philippines, they had a run on the banks then there, or just before it. So Joffrey, you can tell us what happened.
Pretty much how Brian described it, but there's a solution pretty much out of a crisis like that, and that can be a topic for another Politics in the Pub. Bail out the borrowers, bail out the first-time homeowners, bail out those who need a home, rather than bail out the banks. If the banks want to be bailed out, bail the people out first.
Yeah.
If they don't want to bail out the people, then let the banks close and let the governments take over them. Thank you. Not yet.
I think
Joffrey has never been in charge.
I think there will always be institutions that lend more than they have the capital for. This credit is created over centuries, and there's a need for them. But it does produce a potential threat on the stability of the system, which is why the regulators, like the governments and APRA, are so terrified. Frankly, I doubt it will ever happen in Australia. My major concern about the system is that there's been pressure over the decades for governments to borrow from the private sector, and rather than to generate, to print money on a constrained basis, which has actually happened in the past, right across the world, in Australia, in the US, etc., and so restrains the growth of public debt and dependence upon the private sector, and so it's this massive public debt which all the banking sector and the rating agents perennially pressuring governments to cut spending, which of course it's the welfare area. So that's the area which I think remains under the radar, and if ever you raise it, people say you're a crank, etc., which deserves greater exposure.
This has already happened, by the way. You made me think this thing through. It happened at GFC, whether you're aware of it or not.
Yes.
It happened, especially with the ANZ Bank. These banks were stupid enough to put all their eggs into the American mortgage market, home mortgage market, and then that home mortgage market collapsed and had to call the banks up. ANZ Bank was badly caught. I know that for a fact. Yeah, and the NAB too, they were caught. So what you're saying there could happen, but hopefully they've got more common sense now, which besides me and you, not many people have got, right? And we're back to you.
Thank you, John. Next question, please.
Okay. Jim from Greenleaf Weekly. Thanks very much to the speakers. It's been really fantastic. I just want to roll back a little bit. In 1916, Vladimir Lenin wrote a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which basically talked about finance capital. And this is the really early stage. This was the early stage of the integration of finance and industrial capital. And what we've seen now in the 21st century is this being carried to the higher stage, where, to me, finance capital has actually come to predominate. And the GFC showed that. And we're now facing a massive crisis. And all the things that Evan talked about, the way it's affecting the ordinary people, small business, the ordinary customers and so on, and what we're seeing with AMP, even people that have got, a small insurance policy like myself. I don't even know what happened to it. Everyone is suffering because of this system, and to me, we've reached now a critical point. The Banking Royal Commission is going to come out with some probably solutions that are not going to tackle the main problem. I think what has already been referred to as part of the solution. We have got to take back control of the financial industry and the banking industry, I think, with not only the Commonwealth Bank, but nationalise the whole lot and put them under a system of workers and public control, because one of the problems that happened with the Commonwealth Bank is it was corporatised and became part of the overall system before it was actually nationalised. That was part of the process. So we have got to reverse this whole thing and exercise democracy and take back control. The people must take back control of our banking system, our financial system, as part of taking back the whole thing. And I call it one word, the S word, socialism, and there's no other way around it. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Because of that, I think everyone agrees with that one. Next question, please.
No, I'm a male chauvinist pig. You can go before me.
Well,
I'm a very
just a couple of things. What's the chance of getting Evan's talk turned into a background briefing on the ABC? It was fabulous, really fabulous. Oh, and also written up in Greenleaf Weekly as a feature article as well. Two small things regarding that legislation about banks being able to dip into your accounts. My understanding was that in Australia there's a a law or an agreement that banks will guarantee up to $250,000 for any individual account holder. Is that, I mean, by the sound of that, it sounds like that guarantee is not worth the paper
It's up to the government to back it.
well, your comment on that. And the other thing is your comment on Credit Union of Australia as how it performs in this context. Yeah.
Because of time limitations, can we have two questions, please, in succession?
Great. I'm thinking of travelling to Iceland next year, and it's a sparkle at something. During the financial crisis, was it Iceland that bought the banks?
Yes.
Can someone give us a bit of information?
They jailed their bankers. I went there too.
Did it?
In 2016.
So what actually happened in
Yeah, tell us, Kathy.
Yes, Kathy, come on down.
Iceland rock.
I don't really.
Come on
I'm
down.
filming, but.
Little one by itself.
Well, what I know is there was a kind of a pots and pans revolution. They all got outside their outing. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but that's their name for parliament. It's the oldest parliament in the world, 900 years old. And 10% of the population were outside the parliament, banging pots and pans. You can imagine the sound that it made. That happened a couple of times, but the thing was that they just changed their parliament. They jailed. They ended up jailing their bankers.
Yay!
The last one was put in jail not so long ago. And, there are some things in Iceland that didn't redress, the price of real estate, for example, but a lot of things got better, yeah, because of that.
You didn't have to sell out to the IMF.
Just finishing it off. Just following on from that, was there something about where they actually, they didn't bail the banks out?
No, they didn't. No.
They didn't bail them out?
No.
They bought them or something and then sold it back to them at a profit or something?
They
nationalised
the banks. They nationalised the
That
banks.
was it. Okay,
Nationalised.
yeah, just
Sorry,
want clarification on that. Thank you. Thank you, Brain Trust.
Except they paid nothing for them.
The IMF tried to get them to sell their fish stocks. They refused, and now they're doing great guns because they didn't.
Stand
And also,
Yeah.
women were actually put as directors of the banks.
That's right.
God, I remember in second.
Regarding the second speaker, thank you for an interesting talk. There's a lot of things I learned that I think a lot of us didn't know about in terms of the behaviour of the banks. One of the interesting things you raised was how complicit the judges, the lawyers, the legal system is. We talk about the law, and yet we really should be talking about the legal system, which is actually a technical hierarchy that is actually not always based on justice or what we assume. My question is, if we were to expose the judges, the lawyers, and the legal and the politicians who are actually complicit to this, like you're doing tonight, how would that actually? What sort of influence would that have on the banks in terms of challenging their impunity towards the legal system and actually their obligation to society? And secondly, in the early 1980s, Reagan actually jailed 2,600 financiers and bankers. We haven't been able to even get one that I'm aware of put into prison. Are our prison systems failing us, or should we find a special way of actually putting them directly into prison without actually having their own trials simply because they're above the law? Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, I was saying privately, the legal system looks after their own, self-regulated, and what I've found sad and tragic is that even honest lawyers, like Michael Kirby, for example, or there's a New South Wales judge called Andrew Rogers, now retired, will never speak out publicly against their own profession. So the rot continues, and consistently you get a judge comes into the court and says, and there will be litigation involving a bank, and the judge says, I am a customer of this particular bank, does anybody object? And nobody objects. and so he continues to sit, and he'll perennially decide in favour of the bank with which he is a customer. It defies belief. So, you know, I don't see any way at the moment. It's so well, there's so much deference that a senior figure will in the judicial system will be chucked out because of corruption. Lawrence Street just died recently. He was fated. That's bullshit. He was part of the problem. And someone else forgot. Just while I've got the mic, the Commonwealth Bank, as I think Joffa said, was before the privatisation was corporatised, or even in the 80s when it was still public. It participated mightily in the foreign currency loan scam, which was criminal. Huge number of people suffered. They're still suffering, those who are alive. And the key person who demolished what was left of the public character of the Commonwealth Bank was David Murray. Now, he is one of the great frauds, and yet he is held up these days as a guru in banking and put in charge of everything and about to put as chair of the AMP. He is utterly representative of the dysfunctionality and corruption of the system.
The credit union, yeah, please.
We all go to the credit union, eh?
They're okay as long as they stick to consumer loans. If they get into business loans, they're going to be in trouble. They haven't got the culture to handle it. They haven't got the people to handle it. The other problem I got to tell you about, if you nationalize the banks, it's not going to change much. And well, yeah, it might change things, but the problem with having a private bank is that they pay good salaries. So the people that work for the government will want high salaries. They want high salaries. They have to justify it. If they justify it by doing more loans, and of course that's the problem comes in, because a lot of loans will stink. They'll be rotten. So it's a very, very tough situation to change the situation, but it's got to start with the regulators and government. They got to put some of these people in jail, like you said. If they put them in 1 or 2 in jail, and I've suggested that, by the way, to my minister in Linfield. I said, put a couple of them in jail and you'll change things right away. They won't do it.
And in response also to credit unions and microfinance, if I may add, they do not follow the fractional reserve system in banking. They do not lend money by creating money. They have to first collect loans that they've issued before they can issue new loans.
That's right.
And that also explains why they have a very impressive collection rate and low default rates compared to the banks.
Okay, Frank.
Thank you. Yes, Frank?
Evan, have you found anything
They make loans from
fishy about
computer
the
screens.
credit union?
No.
No.
I want to thank both speakers. I think it's been very insightful. We've learned that banks are bad for small businesses, for farmers, for households. I'm wondering whether banks are bad for capitalism. That old-fashioned capitalism which involves employing workers, producing things, selling commodities. We're hearing a story here about a set of institutions that's creaming off a lot of the economic surplus that's being generated in a capitalist economy. Is this bad for capitalism as well as opposing everything that socialists stand for?
We've lost the balance. I think the point you're making, Frank's a good one, because there was a balance and one sector didn't dominate the whole system, but the banking system does, because it's got the money, and it's got the money, it can change the rules, and that's the problem. They change the rules, or they do it so that the people who do the rules, manage the rules, won't act against them. That's the problem with the banking system. They will not enforce the rules. Commonwealth Bank should be shot. A couple of those people should be in jail. I can mention a couple of other banks that have had similar situations.
Yeah, every CEO of the Big Four since the 80s should be in jail, frankly. Just confirming Jim's point earlier about what's now called financialisation. you know, I'm crude enough to agree with what Frank just said, that I actually looked up national income statistics a while ago, and the percentage of profits in the system going to business profits going to the corporate finance sector went from something like 5% in 1981 when we had the beginning of deregulation to now it's about 23%. So it's hitting on a quarter of all business profits. A quarter of all corporate profits and about 17% of all business profits, including unincorporated businesses. So there is an utterly parasitical element. And another figure from the Reserve Bank, that the Big Four have pricing power, administered pricing, and so if they suffer for some reason, they just up their fees or lower the interest rate for depositors, and their rate of return, net rate of return on profits has been 15% consistently year on year for the last several decades since the early 90s. Whereas, and it's coming from other business, so it's an utterly parasitic sector. And of course, there's all those damn high-rises everywhere, finance sector, and their salaries are gigantic, and they shift figures around.
That's the highest in the world. The banking system in Australia is very, very profitable, and I don't think they're really telling us the whole story about how much money they're making.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have exceeded our time, and I'll have to put the forum to the close, but you're free to approach the speakers.
Next week.
And next week, what are we going to have? Health. The issue will be on Medicare. Is it... trying to get the... Okay, it will be on health insurance. Is it necessary or desirable? Our speakers will be Dr. Arthur Chesterfield Evans, medical practitioner, former Australian Democrats MP, and Ian Macaulay, lecturer, public sector finance from the University of Canberra. Thank you very much and see you next week.